Welcome back to Let's Talk Universal podcast, and we're marking 1 full year of podcast interviews with workforce and workplace practitioners and thought leaders. So thank you for joining us and listening to our fabulous guests over the last year, but we're not stopping. We have even more incredible interviews coming in the next few weeks and months, and today I'm really excited to be joined by Rob Brougham, CEO and co-founder of Braided Communications Limited. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you very much. I didn't realise it was your birthday on the podcast. Happy birthday.
Yeah, I know. How incredible is that? I can't believe that the first episode that we aired was, around this time of year. It was August, September that we recorded and published the first one. And that was about neurodiversity. And I'm grateful that we're going to be able to touch on the neurodiversity topic again today, because I'm really interested to learn more about, we've already spoken previously, but to really share with people the opportunity that Braided Communications and the platform and the meetings and the interviews offers for organisations, particularly around neurodiversity. But first, before we get too deep into that topic, I wondered if you might introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yeah, sure. So thanks again, Erica, for inviting me. My name is Rob Brougham. Co-founder and CEO of Braided Communications. Braided Communications is about 5 years old. It kind of started just before the lockdown. Before that, I've done a whole variety of things, starting with a degree in astrophysics, moving through a whole bunch of time in telecoms and digital health before I ended up working in Braided.
Amazing stuff. And so I think we're gonna have to start, Rob, with the space story. How was it that Braided as a business and a product was began? How did it begin?
Sure. So it started in the space sector, and it started by solving a problem for future space communication with astronauts. I don't want to go into too many details, but I'll keep it as sort of simple as possible. But as I'm sure most of the listeners will know, astronauts in space communicate back to Earth using radio waves. And generally, when you've got people on the International Space Station, as we do now, that's absolutely fine, because they're so close. The radio waves travel very fast, and there's no issues at all, just as we're talking here from different parts of the country. When humans potentially go back to the moon, as they might do in a few years' time, and then even potentially further, who knows, maybe one day we will actually get people to go to Mars, people will be so far away from Earth that there's going to be a communication delay on all the messages back to Earth, which can be very significant, because we're all human beings. We've all evolved in an environment where we don't cope well with delay. All of us have been on video calls where there's a little bit of delay, and it can really throw you out. You're trying to have a conversation and the slightest delay can throw you off. If that delay is several seconds or even many minutes, it's a much bigger problem. So that's the problem the space sector has got to deal with in the future. And because it's caused by the basic law of physics, you can't solve it with science or engineering. It's always going to be there. So we came out in a different way, and we thought very deeply about how human beings communicate, and we understood some of the adaptability humans have. And we came up with our first invention, which we called space braiding, which is a way of disguising that latency. So if you were on Mars and I'm here on Earth, we could communicate in a way that would feel to both of us like a natural flowing dialogue, even though there'd be a delay. So we came up with that idea. We managed to find a way to go and plug our way into a conference in Houston back before lockdown that was amazing. It was full of flight surgeons and mission controllers and astronauts. There were so many astronauts in there, it was unbelievable. And we managed to get one or two of them to look at our idea and actually go, hey, that just might work. So we're insanely proud of the fact that as a small British company, the result of that, we ended up with an opportunity to work with NASA. So our first income actually came from NASA studying our idea. So that's where it all started.
What an incredible story, and it's so interesting. And then actually looking at the way that humans communicate as well, and that leads us into the organizational piece. What problem is Braided helping organizations to solve then?
So great question, and the this is something that we came to understand over a period of time. What we realized was this thing we'd invented for space, when we tried to use it to communicate on Earth, it was actually really effective in some slightly unusual ways. We couldn't quite work out immediately why. It took a long time with a lot of work with internally and externally to work out what was happening. And it turns out what we're doing is we're solving a problem which is, from a psychological point of view, is known as co-presence. So this is the way I like to describe it. It's the feeling you get if you're sat on the sofa with a close friend or a family member and the conversation just flows. That feeling of co-presence is what you need to have effective communication. There's a big problem because the thing called co-presence is not the same as co-location. So you can be sat in the same room or sat on the same video call with a bunch of other people. But even though you're co-located with them physically or virtually, you're not actually feeling that sense of co-presence. So you're not able to communicate in some cases. And this is why we've all seen this. You sit in a business meeting and 2 or 3 people do almost all the talking. And it's not because all the other people don't have good ideas. Generally, it's because those other people, for various reasons, don't at that moment feel that sense of co-presence. So they don't feel able to engage. They're not necessarily aware of this. It's just something that's preventing them communicating in a very sort of primeval way. And that's a problem in many meetings. You end up with very polarized outputs from all the people who are confident and extrovert and talk a lot. They're the ones whose ideas go forward. And if they've got the best ideas, that's great. But all the other ideas leave the room, and they leave the room with participants feeling faintly disenfranchised, if you like. And what we realized was this different approach to meetings, which we now call on Earth Braided Meetings, creates an environment where everyone can contribute equally. So it creates this amazing environment for equitable conversations in which all people can contribute at the same time.
I mean, it's a fantastic idea, Rob, because really, a lot of organizations will be looking at how do I, in meetings particularly, which a lot of the time can feel like a bit of a waste of time if there's always, just one person giving the idea or, only the loud voices are heard. And so I see this as something that organizations and HR leaders and line managers will be really interested in. But let's talk about neurodiversity, because I guess that's also a huge challenge for these organizations, particularly, line managers in learning how to integrate and work with and support neurodivergent people within their business and to get them involved in those types of meetings. Could you maybe elaborate on some of the challenges that neurodivergent individuals might face in these, traditional meetings and interviews?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a whole variety. And of course, every individual has their own personal experiences and their own sort of personal story. And the way it affects everybody is different. And one of my favorite phrases actually is an adaptation of an old phrase. So the phrase, great minds think alike is, in my opinion, not true. Great minds do not think alike. You need diversity of thought in order to get outcomes that you want. So to your point there, if you've got a group of people who almost by definition are thinking differently because they are neurodiverse in some way, allowing them to contribute is hugely beneficial to the outcome of the meeting. Why don't they contribute? Well, as I said, many, many reasons. And there's some sort of personal experience I've got here and experience from friends and colleagues, etc. So some people really struggle with eye contact. Some people really struggle with the way they're perceived in meetings. So actually, large parts of their brain while they're sat there in a meeting are not thinking about the subject matter, but they're thinking, kind of, am I sitting right? Do I look okay? Am I being perceived correctly? If you've got a huge part of your brain focusing on that stops you actually thinking about the subject that's the meeting agenda. Almost kind of another side of that coin. Some people just talk too much, and there's phrases like some people think to talk, some people talk to think. I'm very guilty of that latter one. In many meetings, I have to spend a lot of my cognitive resources, to use a slightly technical term. I spend a lot of that effort thinking, don't talk. This is not your time to talk. And for me, it's very hard not to talk. So I'm spending a lot of time doing that. It's harder for me then to engage in the meeting. So those are just a couple of examples where people struggle. And in braiding, because of the way it works, there is no eye contact, there's no audio and no video in a braided meeting. It's all entirely a written mode of communication. And because it's very organized and each person has a fair and equal opportunity to contribute, for people like me who talk too much, I can't talk over other people. It just technically isn't possible. So I find myself contributing better as well. So it's just a couple of examples there.
Yeah, I think, as you say, it's perhaps not even neurodivergent, but, just the different ways that minds think and people work. So when it comes to the organisation, what do you think is the biggest challenge when it comes to employing and integrating neurodivergent talent?
Great question. Huge question. Obviously, there's a lot.
Mm.
There's a lot in there. I think that let's take it as two chunks. We'll come back to the challenge of employing people. If you want to be proactively inclusive and target neurodivergent job seekers, or indeed any individual who's kind of, let's say, not sort of mainstream normal, as it were, or that's the wrong word to use, but average, let's say. Then you've got a lot of things to do to make that happen. But actually, if you look at all the stats, the percentage of people who are neurodiverse tends to be thought of as being either 15 or 20%. That's 1 in 5. Now, there's good evidence that many neurodivergent individuals struggle to get jobs, but there are many neurodivergent individuals in work. So those sort of companies already employ these people. They may not even know, the individuals may not be fully aware that they're neurodiverse. They may never have had a diagnosis. They may never have understood this as a concept, but they may be sitting there struggling, but they're just keeping their head above water and doing enough to remain in the role. But the companies could do a lot more by improving awareness, by thinking about how to allow all groups of people to work together effectively. Now, there's a lot of work going on in those areas, and a lot of companies are doing a lot of very, very good work in that area. I think a lot of them would be really quite surprised if they genuinely knew the depth of talent they've got there. There was a report that came out just before Christmas, which was called Neurodiversity in the Tech Sector. And an organization went out and interviewed, I think, about 2,000 people in various tech companies. And the percentage that came back self-declaring as saying, I think I'm neurodiverse in some way or another, was extraordinarily high. So those companies began to realize they've got to create environments in which those people can thrive. And there's also good evidence that if you create environments in which individuals who are currently isolated can thrive, the whole group lifts up as well. So, what's that old phrase? A rising tide raises all boats. So if you enhance the ability of someone in a team to improve their performance, that whole team's performance will improve as well.
And I think you're completely right in that actually it's just the misconception that either neurodiversity doesn't already exist in your organisation, and that actually that it just comes back to understanding that it already exists in your organization in the first place. I think that's the biggest one, really, and that report, I know which one you're referencing, is shocking, because I think it was something like 3% of their workforce. So organizations were saying that they identify 3% of their workforce as being neurodivergent, whereas actually when you ask the employees, it was like 30-40%. It was in that region. So there's that
Absolutely.
Clear disparity between the two. So let's go back to Braided then. So how does Braided Meetings specifically address these challenges and help to create that more neuro-inclusive environment? So maybe create a scenario in how that might help a team.
Sure. So Braided Meetings is visual. So this is always a challenge to explain on podcasts, but I'll give it a go. And anyone listening can just go and look at some of the videos on our website. But in a Braided Meeting, it's entirely written, as I said before. So there's no audio and there's no video. And if you think about any meeting, we all should pre-plan. Who do we need? Who don't we need? What's the agenda, etc. So essentially what we do in Braided Meetings is you take the agenda items and each one of them becomes a separate, almost a chat window. But the way these chat windows work, each chat window is active for one participant at one moment in time and only for that participant. So you and I could be having a one-to-one on Braided, and we might have 3 or 4 topics to talk about. I would be typing on one topic A at the moment. I'm typing on topic A. You're typing on topic B, and topic C and D are currently, there's no one active on them. What happens is these topics are arranged on a visual carousel that rotates in virtual space. So after a preset time that you and I have agreed, what I was typing goes around the corner to you, and you can see what I was typing. You can then build on it, challenge it, agree with it, disagree with it, etc. I get a new topic and you get a new topic. And that's the way a braided meeting works. The agenda items essentially go around the table from person to person. To give it a couple of real examples, as you said, so there's one of the companies that uses us that's a training company, and they use it for some senior leadership team meetings. What they're a very relatively small company and a very inclusive focused company. So they've always tried very hard from the very beginning to be inclusive. But what the CEO says is, despite all that being embedded in their culture, there are still some voices that tend to dominate, not deliberately, but people tend to sort of be more aware that person X and person Y are kind of more senior, so their views hold more weight. And the CEO doesn't want that. So in a braided meeting, all the participants get their equal weight in a leadership team meeting, just a classic leadership team meeting. Another good example is daily stand-up meetings. Big challenge. Lots of people here be doing daily stand-up meetings. One of the biggest challenges with daily stand-up meetings is they overrun, right? And when they overrun, they're supposed to be short, sharp. I think the experts say, maximum of 15 minutes. If you've got someone who talks a little bit too much, you're way over the 15 minutes. So either you have to stop, and not everyone contributes, or you just run over. Now, in a braided meeting, one of the most important things is once you've preset it up, it will start, it will run, and it will always finish on time. So it's an amazing ability to keep people on time, and it works so well for daily stand-up meetings. Each person, when they start, they're on a particular braid with their name on. They do the usual agenda for a daily stand-up, which is typically what I did yesterday, what I plan to do today, and what my challenges are. And then as the carousel rotates, their colleagues can all add value by hoping to sort of solve their problems, if you like. So there's a couple of examples there of how it works in practice.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's some really key kind of words popping out to me as you talk. It's like collaboration, but also, giving everyone space and like giving their voice equal value. So there's some really interesting things to be coming out of what you're saying. And I guess, in a way it's we started off talking about neuro-inclusivity, but actually, it's helping to improve team productivity and efficiency, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. Efficiency is a key piece of feedback we get from people who play with braided. It's absolutely true. And a braided meeting is an incredibly efficient use of time. Because of the way everyone's contributing continuously, you have this extraordinary amplification effect. So an example I like to give is if you imagine a half-hour meeting with 4 people in a traditional environment, you end up with half an hour of output as each person contributes in turn. And that output's probably dominated by the 2 loudest voices. Put the same 4 people in a braided environment for the same half an hour. First of all, you get 2 hours of output because everyone's contributing continuously. So you've got a 4-fold amplification of simple output. Secondly, because the 2 people who are less dominant, if you like, in terms of speaking, their ideas emerge. So you've got twice as many good ideas in the meeting. So by that logic, that braided meeting is 8 times more efficient than the same meeting in a traditional format. So it's really quite extraordinary how efficient they are. It means braided meetings sometimes always are very short. No one has yet done a 1-hour-long braided meeting and then done it again. They always go for shorter meetings because you don't need longer meetings. They're very efficient use of time, and you get so much out of it. So yeah, productivity and efficiency are actually probably, I think, bigger benefits than the neuro-inclusivity benefits long-term for organisations that adopt braiding.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you've already said, we see examples of companies using braided for internal meetings. So I guess the question that I want to ask is that, well, actually, we've kind of already addressed it, because the question was, how does braided address other kind of personality or communication styles? But actually, I guess, as you've already said, it just anyone in your team can see benefits from this, whether they're introverted or whether that actually this spans across all neurotypes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. When we first took braided meetings, when we first took space braiding and invented braided meetings, the the thought internally was this is going to be fantastic for neuro-inclusivity, and it absolutely is. But very quickly it's evolved beyond that, because we've had people saying to us that they felt more able to contribute in a meeting. For example, there might be the youngest person in a meeting full of people who are 10, 20, 30 years older than them, or vice versa. Could be the only female in a room full of males, the only male in a room full of females, whatever it might be. There's lots of reasons why, going back to that thing at the beginning of co-presence, lots of reasons why people might feel perfectly at ease in one meeting, and then they go into the next meeting and suddenly it's just not there for them. And if you can recognize that as an individual, and sometimes say, hey, can we have a braided meeting, or more likely a braided section in part of this meeting, because you can have a 1 hour long meeting, and in the middle of it you have a 20-minute braided session, and you get then the best of both worlds.
And I have two questions. The first I'm going to ask because I don't want to forget it, which is actually, when it comes to kind of integrating this into systems, is it just an app that an organisation can put on people's laptops? Does it integrate into something? How does that kind of fit?
Yeah, so it's a simple web app. So it's a software as a service in the cloud. So you don't need to download anything. You don't need anything on your laptops. People just register for a braided host account, and then they can have braided meetings with anyone they wish. So you can invite anyone, internal or external. You just need to know their email address, send them an email invite. They then come in on a web browser, just like you and I are recording this webinar on this browser studio here. It's the same sort of concept here. So nothing to download, nothing like that. They can just simply go onto our website or contact us for a demo and get an account and start using it.
And that was going to be my second question, was about the external piece, because I guess there's also an opportunity to use this in conversation with potential clients, if there's multiple topics around like a contract that are being discussed, that actually, this can be used in those circumstances as well.
Absolutely. The way Braided is designed to work, much like many other virtual meeting services, is the person who's setting up the meeting needs the account. Once they've done that, they can invite anybody they wish. So yeah, absolutely. People use it externally. Internally, I mean, Braided is still new, as you know, Erica. So it's not like we've got thousands and thousands of customers and thousands of use cases. We're getting there. So I guess if I looked at it, the majority of usage is internal, but there's absolutely external usage. I think one of the really interesting things about that is because braiding is so, it's simple, but it really is. This is my favorite phrase. It's like nothing else on earth, because it was invented for use in space. So the first time someone joins a braided meeting, they're like, this is a bit different. And the second time they're like, oh, this is that braided thing. This is cool. So it does take a little bit of getting used to, if you like. But once someone's got used to it, they tend to find it super valuable and very quickly work out which sessions can be benefiting from braided meetings and which ones can't, because it's not for all meetings all of the time. Absolutely not.
Yeah, and that makes sense. So we've spoken about meetings a lot, and I guess there's also the interview part to Braided as well, which I want to talk about, because I find that as part of the neurodivergent journey into work, the interview piece is often the onboarding interview, hire, onboarding chunk of that journey is often off-putting or not flexible enough for neurodivergent people to actually get through that process to into employment. So I wondered if you could kind of talk about the interviews and how that could potentially, in the neurodivergent use case, help to build out neurodiverse friendly recruitment strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. And braided interviews and braided meetings are kind of, they're very much sister products. If you look at them, they look very similar. But braided interviews have absolutely been specifically designed to support recruitment interviews. And unlike braided meetings, which does a broader inclusivity and a broader efficiency piece, braided interviews very much is around neuro-inclusive interviewing. And when we started working on this and started doing some of the background research, I got quite shocked by some of the stats about the low level of employment of neurodiverse individuals, how challenging it can be. And when you look at it, it's kind of in some ways not surprising given that most recruitment processes still at some stage have an interview. And many people, not just neurodiverse people, but many neurodiverse people in particular, will struggle with a face-to-face interview. And it's quite clear from various research that many such individuals will actually self-select out of the process. They know they could do the job, but they know they won't pass the interview. So why put yourself through the stress and the hassle of doing it? Now, a lot of companies have been aware of this for a while, as I'm sure you know. So people have tried to make their recruitment processes more neuro-inclusive. And there are a lot of simple things you can do. Classic one is making sure that your wording in your advert is unambiguous, etc. And those things are great. And then another one is send the questions out in advance, which tends to now be perceived as good practice for all interviews. Trouble is that if you send the questions out to a group of people and five of them are going to come in for face-to-face interviews and two of them ask for a non-face-to-face interview, the gold standard for doing that historically has been email. So you might email me the questions now. I answer them this evening, send you back my answers. You come back with follow-up questions the day after, etc. So it takes maybe 4 or 5 days elapsed process for you to interview me on email. And in the meantime, you've already interviewed 3 people who are equally good for the role. And all of those people decided to go for a face-to-face interview because they weren't so worried about it. And you think, it's not worth waiting for Rob. He looks like a good candidate, but actually I've got these other 3 people. I'm going to give the job to one of them. So that whole process puts the neurodiverse candidate at a disadvantage. And of course, puts the company at a disadvantage if it genuinely wants to be inclusive to everybody. So what we realized was that actually, if you could put a braided meeting in there and adapt it to make it very suitable for the interview mode, which is what we did. So if you were interviewing me on a braided interview, you'd have control of the questions, you'd see my answers, you'd then ask follow-up questions, just as you would in a regular interview. But it's all done in a synchronous, albeit an inclusive manner. So I don't look at you, I don't hear you, I just see what you've written and you see what I've written. But it's all done in a kind of a time-boxed, inclusive, synchronous manner. So you could be interviewing me on braided interviews, and then at 4 o'clock you interview someone else face-to-face, and at 4:30 you interview someone else on braided interviews. So all of the candidates have an equal chance to impress you, regardless of their chosen mode of interviewing.
I think that's so important, is actually having that flexibility and option of how a candidate can, go through that process and how they want to be interviewed. Because, if it's not an in-person interview, maybe they're happy with a video interview, but just with their camera off. Or, if they're not, if they want to have the questions in advance and then have a braided interview, or even just a braided interview and, have those questions, answer them there and then. There's a way of giving that choice to a candidate in a way that makes them feel comfortable. And I don't think it's just for neurodivergent people. Any person might choose, to have a braided interview over having an in-person interview. It's not necessarily.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's a couple of things that I'd say on that. So first of all, the choice is key. So we would never suggest that someone should always use braided interviews for all candidates. You want every candidate to have the best chance to shine. We actually work closely with a company called Diversita, which is a specialist recruiter in the neurodiverse space. And they now offer all their candidates braiding as an option, alongside other options as well. So that's what they consider to be good practice. So you're absolutely right. And some people will select it not because they're neurodivergent, but because of various other reasons, whatever it might be. I think another thing that we haven't really been able to explore yet, but I'm really excited to explore this over time. I've worked in a couple of very big companies, and I've done plenty of recruiting there. And I've seen back in the day, some colleagues who would not want to do the recruitment. They'd kind of delegate it to someone else in their team, whatever. And I have a hypothesis that some of those people were as scared of the other side of the interview as the candidates were, possibly for the same reason. So I actually think that braided interviews over time will be helpful, not just for candidates to give them a fair choice, but also for people who are going, actually, I want the person who's the expert to do the interview, regardless of their views on how they feel about face-to-face interviews. And giving employers that choice is something that I also think is quite interesting. Now, that's just a hypothesis. I haven't really had the chance to dig into that yet with any of our customers, but I want to soon.
Absolutely. And I think that would be really interesting, because I think we often forget, going back to that point of, what's the biggest challenge, is that misconception that neurodiversity doesn't already exist in your organisation. And if we're looking at hiring managers and line managers who are responsible for bringing on or interviewing talent, that actually they may also be neurodivergent, and that they might prefer to do, something that isn't an in-person interview. And I think, even for myself, when I've done interviews, I've kind of had a bit of imposter syndrome of, am I qualified enough? Am I high enough to be actually leading this interview? So, there is that side as well. And I think that would be really interesting to learn more about it.
Yeah.
And so we've kind of touched on, the time saving of using a tool like Braided as a maybe an array of options for candidate interviews. But are there any other kind of outcomes that teams HR or an organisation might look forward to as a result of using Braided?
Lots, yeah, loads. I think there's a couple. You said early on in the podcast, I can't remember if it was in your introduction or whatever, but you talked about meetings being sort of sometimes often considered a waste of time, etc. So if you've got a group of people, you've got an organization, and people are going, "Oh, I've got to go to a meeting," because we all go to meetings. This is what that's not just a waste of time within the organization, but it can genuinely sort of depress morale, if you like. If people don't feel that same sense of negativity, you've got a much more positive environment. People don't feel their time is being wasted so often. The benefit of that isn't just that genuinely their time isn't wasted, but also they're genuinely happier people. So there's one example there. A couple of other examples over time tend to be, as I said before, about diversity of thought. If you build a genuinely diverse team, and then that team starts to thrive and starts to genuinely create outcomes that are more significant, then you've got a positive outcome for the company. There was a report published by Deloitte about a couple of years ago that talked about Neuro-Inclusive teams being 30% more efficient than other teams. But given what we talked about before, that there's so many neurodiverse people out there, probably most teams are already neurodiverse. It's just they're not neuro-inclusive. So if you can create that neuro-inclusivity, you've got that boost as well. So there's a whole bunch of things like that, and I'll give you along the lines of here one other example of one of the users that used Braided, which was a big recruitment company actually, and they used it in terms of HR. There was a staff survey that had happened, and staff had fed back, and they weren't happy about lots of things. And then when the senior leadership asked for suggestions to improve it, everyone was quiet. And so when they then asked the same question in a Braided meeting, people felt more able to share. So there's something different about contributing in a Braided meeting in terms of being more open to sharing ideas and thoughts, whether that was because it wasn't audio and video, or whether it was because people knew they were going to have the time and the space to lay down their thoughts without being interrupted. We don't actually know the genuine reason, but whatever reason was, suddenly they got these outputs. So trying to find ways of getting people to contribute.
Sometimes it's just being the first one to speak. I remember during my acting degree, we did a lot of workshops, and it was who's going to be the first one to make that funny noise. There's that inherent who's going to be the first. So I guess as well, it's yes, giving everyone the time and space to give their own opinion, but it's also not having that social pressure of being the first to speak necessarily. You haven't got all those eyes watching you at the same time. So I guess I'd like to ask Rob, what happens if organizations don't find, or if organizations don't find better ways to manage the communication of their workforce?
So it's a great question. I wasn't expecting that question, but it's a great question. And I think what happens is what's happening today. That's what's happening out there. For everybody, that's what's happening. So that is the status quo, and this is one of our biggest challenges as a small company with a new product that we know makes a big difference. But it's not because it's so different from anything else. It's people don't realize there's a problem there to be solved because it's just the way it's always been. This is one of those things that if people do something a little bit different, whether that's being more neuro-inclusive as a whole, whether it's adopting braided meetings and then becoming more neuro-inclusive as a result, whether it's whatever it might be. But the opportunity is there to kind of take a step up and a step forward is my view on that. So it's not like there's a negative of not doing it, unless you say there's a negative in everything there is today, which I guess in some ways maybe there is. The point is that because of the way organizations are, because of the diversity of individuals in those organizations, creating environments in which that diversity can thrive is going to give individual companies a competitive advantage. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if that answer made sense.
Absolutely. It's essentially the inverse of what we've already said, in the sense that, as a business, your priorities are productivity and high performance to drive those business outcomes, like profit and the things that really matter to the top shareholders and investors. So I think if we're talking about the perhaps long-term impact of things like braided, that by not investigating how to better improve the communication of teams and also that hiring process, you're not getting the talent to bring into your organization firstly as part of that interview process, and then you're not allowing them to thrive and to be contributing in to the organization's productivity and efficiency and all of those great things, hence driving up those all important figures. So I think it is kind of just the inverse of what we've already said. And as more companies embrace neurodiversity, which as a discussion at the moment is seen as a huge competitive advantage for organizations, particularly with AI and technology and needing those abstract minds to manage this new kind of technological revolution, if you like. What role do you see braided playing in the future of work? Do you see it expanding perhaps beyond meetings and interviews, or are you not kind of thinking beyond that right now?
So thinking beyond it to a degree, certainly braided interviews and braided meetings is there's a lot to do to get that to be embedded as a day-to-day tool wherever it's appropriate to do so. I think what's really interesting for those two is organizations that begin to adopt braided interviews have potentially building a challenge themselves. And I've said this, discussed this with a few companies. One of the easiest things to make neuro-inclusive is your recruitment process as a company, as in proactively go out and do something, because it's a discrete process. It's an end-to-end discrete process. So you can kind of pick the bits and go, we're going to make this whole process neuro-inclusive. If you make that whole process neuro-inclusive, but you don't then make your company a welcoming environment in which people can thrive, you're actually going to make the problem worse, because you're going to spend time and money recruiting people who are going to land in your company, and they can do the jobs you've recruited them for if your recruitment process is any good, and I'm sure it would be. They can do that work, but they can't do that work in an environment that isn't something that they can thrive in. So actually, I think having an opportunity to work with companies to improve their neuro-inclusive recruitment processes is great. But I really want to work with all those companies to say, when these individuals land, what else can be done to make your environment more neuro-inclusive? And that, hopefully, braided meetings is part of that, of course. But there are many, many other things that can and should be done as well. On the other side, we're still doing all of our exciting stuff on the space side. And there's a couple of other things that we're working on there, which are not yet public, so I can't talk about those.
No
but
worries,
there's lots
no
of work
pressure.
going there that might, over time, evolve into new products outside the space sector as well.
Yeah, and I think, the whole point of this is that actually there's an opportunity for organizations to leverage some incredible technology, really, to help improve these day-to-day business processes. And it's I think that's a conversation we're seeing more and more now, especially with, the topic of AI. We're seeing a lot of organizations talk about, should we be using AI in our processes? And I think that in our business. And I think the fact is that actually, in your processes, there's more than enough room, and that actually technology is offering new opportunities, like what Braided is doing. So super exciting stuff, Rob. Can't wait to hear more. We like to ask all of our guests to leave our audience with one last piece of advice for them to take away. So perhaps this is to do with neurodiversity, or perhaps we can focus it on communication, whatever you want to kind of focus it on. But for our listeners, do you have one last piece of advice for them?
Well, obviously there's a piece of advice, which is go try Braided Meetings. You can go register, but above and beyond that, I think it's the conversation you and I had earlier about that report that came out, and I think there's so much in that, in the fact that the numbers you quoted, and I can't remember the numbers, I'm sure you're 100% correct. If you as an organisation think you have a low percentage of people in your workforce who are neurodiverse, you are almost certainly underestimating that to a huge degree. If you become more aware of that, then obviously the opportunity to improve the working environment for those individuals, and therefore make them happier and healthier, etc., and more able to contribute, and also the opportunity to get more for your company, if you like. So it's be aware when you go and ask people. There's a lot more diversity of thought in your organisation than you probably think, and if you could tap into that, you're doing two great things.
100% agreed. All right. So thank you so much for your time today, Rob. It's been great to chat to you. And for our listeners, if you're looking for more actionable insights and advice from expert practitioners, then make sure to sign up for our monthly newsletter and the new industry magazine. So the link will be provided for you in the podcast description if you're interested, or you can look out for the next UWI event on our website at theuwi.com. And the braided links will be in the podcast description as well if you want to go and find out more. But Rob, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erica, and happy birthday again to the podcast.